This is the Multifaith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moria. This is the podcast for Multifaith Matters. It has been a while. If you are a regular viewer and listener, just life has intruded with all kinds of projects and things going on, not only for me, but for my guest today, Stephen Bradford Long. Stephen and I were going to have this conversation many months ago, last year, and then a hurricane hit where he lives, and then he had some personal struggles of his own, and we are finally getting this conversation going. Stephen, it is great to not just exchange emails and text messages, but to see you there on the Zoom.
Yeah, you too. It's great to hear your voice as well. Yeah, I think that we were going to record the weekend of Helene, right?
Yeah,
I
and I
think
think so because I think you texted me and you said, "Hey, I don't know if we can do that because we might lose Wi-Fi," right?
yeah, no, hold on.
Yeah,
I actually
that was
have the
like
messages.
that was the big question. Oh, it might not work because we might lose light.
Um yeah, I said just a heads up, we are about to get hammered by a hurricane.
Right.
We'll text you letting you know if I have power or internet tomorrow, and then later that same day, I said, let's go ahead and reschedule. It's supposed to start getting bonkers here, and I don't know what to expect. Could be bad. Supposed to be worst flooding in a century, apparently. And that
Yeah.
turned out to be Hurricane Helene.
Yeah.
And apocalypse is the appropriate word for what happened here in Western
Right.
North Carolina. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just crazy, that one, and then the huge disastrous fires in Southern
Oh, I
California.
know.
It's
Yeah.
just been crazy,
It
what's
has
going
been crazy.
So, well, I'm glad we're able to do this. And what I thought would be cool is when you and I first met, you were a member of the Satanic Temple, and we formed a friendship, and you've been on a few times talking about what it's like to be a Satanist and all that. But in fact, at one point, I was trying to put together a book proposal you and I were going to work on. I couldn't get the darn thing finalized. It was the hook for the reader was going to be, and the publisher, a Satanist and an evangelical writing a book together.
Yeah.
And then I'm watching your journey and the things that you're writing and posting, and you're no longer a Satanist. And I thought, well, there goes that hook. So
Well, you know what's wild is now I have the weird honor of being a post-Christian and a
yes,
post-Satanist. And
yeah,
so
that's
and that actually that draws in more people. Like I think the Satanist thing was like too scary for a lot of people, but what I found on Substack is suddenly when I talk about being a post-Satanist, everyone loves it. Everyone is so fascinated by it because I think it's a bit safer. It's like, oh, okay, he's come back from like come
right.
back. We can talk about that. I don't actually
Yeah,
think that.
yeah, yeah.
I
I
think
like
I'm still weird, but yeah, no, it's still very I think it's even more exciting to people,
Yeah,
which
so
is funny.
I follow what you do. You're writing on Substack, and we'll include links in the program notes and all of that, so folks can find your Sacred Tension podcast. And you're writing on Substack, and I've been following your journey ever since you and I become friends, and it's fascinating. And I thought it would be helpful for my viewers and listeners to hear the story about your journey and about a so-called nun, None. Would you identify with that term
Yeah.
if
Yeah,
you were?
right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is the first time in my life that I am religiously unaffiliated. So it took me to my 30s, to the age of 35, which is when I kind of formally um, moved beyond Satanism as my core religious identity. It was the first time in, yeah, 35 years that I was ever religiously unaffiliated. And so it's a very new experience to me. And I I think of myself as one of the bound, meaning, I think I have like this two type uh, these two types of people in my head, the bound and the unbound, and the bound are the people for whom religious identification feels necessary and vital to live a good life, and living without a religious structure feels kind of intolerable. And this isn't, and crucially, the bound and the unbound, it cuts across belief, right? And so atheists can be bound and theists can be unbound. But then the unbound are the people for whom organized religious identification feels oppressive. It feels unbearable to them. And so identifying with a religious structure and really allowing it to guide you and structure your life, that feels intolerably constraining. Um, and I've always been one of the bound, right? I've always been one of these people who is most comfortable identifying with and adhering to a religious structure, a scaffold that gives my life meaning and structure and direction and ritual and community and all of that important stuff, right? Um, so it's been very hard to kind of set out on my own and be a nun for the first time, an NONE.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
interesting. As you know, uh, nuns, when it's reported on in the media, one of the things that's frustrating for me as someone who follows the scholarly literature on this stuff is they always say that they lead with atheism and agnosticism
that's right.
first, when actually most nuns are not atheists and agnostics.
That's right.
They're people who have moved away from being comfortable with institutionalized religion and they're pursuing other pathways. So I think you fit in quite well there, even with your atheism. And I know you've got some problems with that terminology because you weren't a new atheist.
Hmm.
I don't think you were ever rabidly anti-theistic. You
No.
just you couldn't accept the existence of God and the supernatural and this type of thing. Is that all correct? Would that be
Yeah,
correct?
that's right. The term that I used was non-theist, where in part because it has a softer connotation, right? And it's also associated with religious traditions like Buddhism, forms of Quakerism, so Unitarian Universalism, non-theism. It's a softer, less strident term that is integrated with sometimes with religion. And so I always took that term. People would ask me, what's the difference between a non-theist and an atheist? And my answer is a non-theist is an atheist who's not an asshole about it, who's not mad about it. Um, right. But and I've moved even, I would say, closer towards agnosticism now, in part because of some spiritual experiences that I've had in meditation that have problematized the materialism that I took for granted. Materialism, I don't mean Madonna material girls, I mean philosophical materialism,
Right.
that the material is all there is. Because, I had some pretty wild spiritual experiences and meditation that it felt like agnosticism was the only compromise that I could come to,
Hmm.
and so genuinely open-handed now in a way that I don't think I was several years ago in terms of claims of the supernatural. I'm still skeptical about the supernatural. I'm still skeptical about God, afterlife, supernatural claims, souls, so the paranormal, all of that. But I would say I think I was always more open on average than other atheists are on, or more open than other atheists are on average. But now I'm even more so, right? Skeptical but open-minded.
Right, right. Yeah. Well, before when you've been on the program, you shared your former Christian background and how you came out of that and became a Satanist. So let's kind of rehash a little of that, and then we'll break new ground for the journey you've been taking since then. Were you raised in a Christian home, or you just
Yes.
gravitated toward that in your youth?
Totally raised in a Christian home, born on the mission field in Taiwan, Taipei, Taiwan. Um, and my father runs an international ministry still. He's in his 70s now. I won't say his name because he didn't volunteer to be talked about online by his degenerate
Sure.
son. But, um, and my mom has been a pastor my whole life as well. So
Hmm.
I was raised in a not just a pastoral setting, but a missions setting, and a charismatic setting. So I was raised speaking in tongues, watching deliverance ministry, or what we
Okay.
would know as exorcism. My dad is does exorcism, and so I was raised in kind of this wild niche setting, and I had no idea how weird it was until really I got into my 20s, and I was like, oh, people aren't raised this way normally. So I was deeply religious and always felt um it was always very uncomfortable. It was always an uncomfortable fit because I am gay. I eventually discovered that I was gay in high school. And of course, that was existentially horrifying in all the ways that you would expect for a conservative kid growing up in the South in an ultra conservative Christian setting. And so I really struggled with that. And that's a whole other story that we can get into. And, but also, even beside that, I was always kind of drawn to the taboo. I asked questions that you weren't supposed to ask. I was drawn to horror. Horror has always been my first love. I think that's one of the things we have in common.
Right. Yeah.
We both love horror. And also, I live with a lot of mental illness struggles where I'm now diagnosed with bipolar 2. That's the other, with psychotic features. That's the other big thing that has happened since we talked as I got diagnosed. Um, and that's really started to assail me when I was 16 years old. And that also complicated things in a religious setting. So there was, even without homosexuality, there was a lot working against me, and it was always a hard fit. And I really struggled for years to kind of find my home within Christianity as I struggled with my faith, as I struggled with my orientation. I had a several year dalliance with Roman Catholicism. I almost converted, decided not to the week of my confirmation. There are lots of side quests that we could go down here, but all that to say, I eventually, around the age of 27, around the age of 26, decided that I had finally lost faith. And it and it was a recognition that these truth claims that I had taken for granted and fought for my entire life, that I could just no longer believe them. And by which I mean the core creedal claims that Christ was raised on the third day from the dead, that God is a Trinity, that there is a God at all, and this wasn't a doubt that was like the seasonal flu. When I hear a lot of Christians talk about doubt, they talk about it as if it's, like this seasonal
Right. Yeah.
testing, and then you get over it and it kind of boosts your faith immune system and you're stronger for it. This was cancer. This was doubt of an entirely different order. And it was devastating. But what I realized in that process was that I still loved Christ and I still loved religion. I could still do, and I still loved Christianity most of all. I could still do Christianity. I just couldn't believe Christianity. But because so much of Protestantism in particular is based on right belief, on orthodoxy rather than orthopraxy, I just was constantly fighting, like rubbing up there was this friction to be a doubter who practiced. And at that point, it's like I decided I have fought for so long for my inclusion in this institution, in these churches, that I'm just exhausted now. It's like this one last battle to be included as a Christian who deeply struggles with belief, it was like, ah, fuck it, that's just too much. It was too much, and I threw the towel in, threw the sword down, and I walked away. And what I walked into was the Satanic Temple, directly into the Satanic Temple. And so I converted straight from Christianity to Satanism, and the reason being that Satanism had everything ready made that I wanted. It was already very friendly to LGBT people. It was already non-theistic, but appreciated the importance of religion as an ordering force for people. It also had the darkness and the edginess that I really resonated with, and it was a home for circus freaks like me. Some literal circus freaks too. I had colleagues who were like fire breathing clowns and that kind of stuff. Um, so it just ticked all the boxes for me, and I was very happy there for about 6 years. Um,
How did you swerve in from Christianity into the Satanic Temple? And was it directly the Satanic Temple, or did you look at all the Church of Satan? It's fascinating to me looking at different forms of Satanism, and
yeah.
I interact sometimes on Twitter or X with the official Church of Satan, and they're very fundamentalist. They're the only true Satanists, right?
Oh yeah, they're
And
extremely
yeah,
fundamentalist, and
and they
there's
really don't like the Satanic Temple. But
yes,
was it Satanism in general, or was it specifically something about TST that you
it
found very
it
appealing?
was it was specifically TST. I had always been drawn to. I had always understood non-theistic Satanism, starting as a teenager, looking into Church of Satan and being like, oh, I get that. And I didn't have to work hard to get it, and I think that that's actually really important, um, because I now have this theory, this idea that Satanism is a religious neurotribe. And what I mean by that is it's like the ability to just seamlessly see Satan as a hero. You don't have to work for it. It's just there. It just arrives inverted, and you're like, I like that guy. That takes a very weird brain, right? In spite of all of the centuries of taboo and fear and darkness and evil and Satan being the personification of evil itself, in spite of all that, being able to look at Satan and be like, I see something beautiful there. It takes a very weird mind to be able to do that. Someone who's kind of immune to social taboo, right? And I think that what that does, that's the lock, or that's the key that opens the door. And so, and then you get access to this very unique, weird group of people for whom things arrive inverted for them. And then you get to hang out in this weird club. And so I think that's what it's doing. I think that's what Satan is. Of course, Satan is the center. He is the central figure and symbol of the religion, but he's also, in a way, just kind of the key that unlocks the door to find community with people who think similarly to you. And it also was specifically about TST, because TST is a satanic reformation. It is a it's an updating of Church of Satan to what we now know about human nature, which is that altruism is important. Social Darwinism doesn't necessarily hold true. And so a lot of Anton LaVey's old ideas, they're just outdated. We need to move on. And the Satanic Temple was, in my understanding, from my perspective, an attempt to update and reform Satanism. It was also it is also a political movement, and I was very drawn to the political activism there. So that's what got me into it. But it was really very seamless. I mean, a lot of people were shocked by the transition because it appeared to happen really suddenly to a lot of people. But to me, it just felt so seamless. And I didn't have to fight for it. I didn't have to work for it. There was zero struggle. It kind of felt like sinking into a warm bath almost. It's just like, oh, okay, awesome. This ability to it felt like a sinking into what felt natural to me.
And you remember for how long of DST?
I was
6 years,
six
you said?
years, 6
6 years.
years.
And you were
Yeah.
involved in leadership.
Yeah. So I was a prominent member for 3 years as a writer, content creator, podcaster, and kind of built a lot of my name on being the guy who talked about Satanism nonstop and wrote about Satanism. And then for the last three of those 6 years, I was a minister and was a leader in ordination council.
Mm. Now,
Yeah.
what was it that led to your departure? Was it just a dissatisfaction of it meeting your spiritual needs eventually, or what? Walk us through that process.
So a lot of things. So I have two articles about this that people can check out. One is called The Limits of Satanism, which is where I talk about how my spiritual needs eventually evolved to the point that Satanism could not meet them. And then a second article called The Weird Travails of a Post-Satanist. And that one is more about the social aspect of how hard it was for, especially towards the end, to be in that community. And I can't get into too many details about the inner workings and what led to it, but both, it was both social and it was spiritual. On the social front, you won't be surprised to learn that people who valorize the ultimate outsider and rebel don't necessarily get along very well,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? And so it eventually became so fatiguing to be in a community that in a lot of ways is very dysfunctional. And um, I think outsider communities in general struggle with this,
Mm-hmm.
where they are particularly vulnerable, I think, to bad actors, or uniquely vulnerable, and they have unique vulnerabilities to bad actors to come swoop in and just create chaos. And I saw that so many times, and it really became unworkable for me personally. And so there was that. But then I started to realize that I needed more stories. And, as I was getting older, as I've been getting older, realized I need stories of not just rebellion and heroism, which is what the satanic story is. He's a hero, um, but I also needed stories of sacrifice, forgiveness, compassion, um, enlightenment, all of that stuff, right? And I needed spiritual practice that really touched the transcendent. I found myself really yearning for for the kind of the sublime, for worship, if you want to use that word. And Satanism scratched some of that itch, but it didn't really meet the need. It had for a long time, but then it was like, okay, I need something more than this. And um so it was a combination of disillusionment with feeling less and less at home, and feeling like my spiritual needs weren't being met. And then a whole additional aspect to this was um, feeling very politically unwelcome, where I kind of started my journey in TST at the far, far, far left, and I have progressed closer to the center.
Mm.
And the more I did that, the less welcome I became, or the less welcome I felt among my colleagues. Now, importantly, this is not true of EM, of executive ministry. The founders, they're great. I've always felt welcomed by the highest ups, but at a lot of other levels of leadership, at a lot of other levels of the community, I felt less and less welcome the more moderate I became. And the real breaking point came when Jonathan Rauch, the writer, heard me say on a show that I didn't even know if I was on the far left anymore, and he wanted to interview me. And he wanted to interview me on my own show about my political journey. I was like, yes, of course, that would be great. So he comes on and interviews me about my political journey. And Jonathan Rauch, for people who don't know, he's a normie centrist gay. He is the most milquetoast liberal normie dude. He works for the Brookings Institute. He's written several great books. He writes for The Atlantic, like totally milquetoast. I don't mean that in an offensive way. He's great. I love Jonathan Rauch. He's been a wonderfully encouraging friend to me in my writing. But the response I got was literally, "You are being radicalized to the far right by Jonathan Rauch." It was insane. It was wild. The emails I got, the conversations I had were just wild. And so that was kind of the tipping point. And I think Jonathan Rauch knew exactly what he was doing, where he
Mm.
knew that this conversation that we had together would get me in trouble with some of the more lefty types, far left types. So yeah, and it was that culmination of all those things that eventually pushed me out. And I'm kind of, it was far more dramatic than, I
Sure.
mean, it was very dramatic. It happened very quickly. It was honestly extremely painful, and I left overnight. I was like, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
So I pulled the plug, and I lost my religious community overnight.
Mm. Yeah. I always find the idea of ideological leanings very interesting and very subjective. In some quarters, I'm considered liberal
Yeah.
within Christianity, and in some, I'm considered, way too conservative. So it's always a
Oh
shifting
yeah, me too.
kind of thing, So
Yeah,
yeah,
same.
happens all the time. Now, so you decided to leave, um, but you've picked up additional, would you call them spiritual tools, disciplines, philosophies? What do you call what you've drawn and expanded your
Mm.
spiritual experience? What do you call those, and how do you use them in your life since leaving the Satanic Temple?
Yeah, so I like the phrase spiritual exercises, which is, the term Saint Ignatius used for the Jesuit spiritual exercises. And I like that term because it kind of gets at the practical athletic feeling aspect of these exercises, where so I meditate every day. I meditate every morning. I do non-dual meditation. And the aforementioned mystical experiences have come about in that setting, mostly within meditation, and just paying very close attention to the experience of consciousness, to the first person experience of consciousness. So I do that. I have found uh, stoicism, philosophical stoicism, extremely helpful. And the ancient Stoics, they had a lot of psychological tricks. They had a lot of psychological tools that were, it's basically like ancient CBT, ancient cognitive behavioral therapy. And CBT was eventually built upon the foundation of philosophical stoicism. And that doesn't mean that I'm not critical of other aspects of stoicism. I am, it's an ancient philosophy. They got a ton wrong. Um, but some of the stuff they got really right. And I think the biggest one of how do I want to say this? Between now and leaving TST, I suffered some of the worst mental health crises in a decade. And so a lot of the spiritual work or spiritual exercises are actually just the exercises to stay sane. I wrote an article called Bipolar Monasticism, which is this concept of, illness is illness can be thought of as a call to a different type of life, to a sacred life, sacred as in set apart, and it requires living in a particular way that feels very burdensome, and it is very burdensome. I can be bitter about that, and sometimes I am, or I can see it as sacred and almost religious, as this is a call for me to live a monastic life almost. And it requires being very disciplined with my life. I have to track everything. I have to track my mood, my sleep, my diet, my exercise, everything. I have to do a lot of work to just stay at baseline or to not sink too far. And what's really interesting to me is how stabilizing Satanism was for me and how stabilizing that community was for me. I did not have a major episode. Well, actually I did. I had one or two major episodes within those 6 years. But that's a pretty good track record for me. And then I left, and suddenly it's like life was before TST. So there was something really stabilizing for me about that religious community. And I've been thinking a lot about that, how it, when you don't have religious community, everything is harder. Paying bills is harder. Getting through life's hardships is harder because there's this sense of I'm on my own. I don't have strangers who care about me, right? And we all focus on those first order relationships, those really close friendships, those people you can call in the middle of the night. We don't focus as much on those second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth order relationships, people who you might just might not even make eye contact with at church, but it's like you're in the same tribe. And those might be the people who come through for you when a hurricane hits, right? Those are the people who show up. And when we don't have those strangers in the tribe with us, and we don't have that sense of communal support of people that you might just make eye contact with or people you might see across the auditorium or whatever, but you're like, we're in this together. Without that, life is hard. Life is really, really hard.
So I
Yeah.
wonder if part of this is, it used to be years ago, previous generations, right? You were born into and raised in a particular tradition and you didn't really question, and that was just part of your assumed identity. And then as we continue to change in society, um, it's all about personal choice, and religion even becomes one of those choices as much as what kind of car do you drive, what kind of clothes do you wear, this kind of a thing.
Yes.
And while that gives you, in a sense, I guess, a feeling of greater autonomy and freedom, at the same time, it's also so radically individualized, it's almost at the expense of community. So, would your experience be that one of the weaknesses that the nuns have to overcome is trying to find community while at the same time finding those spiritual exercises that they find meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, and it also isn't just spiritual exercises, it's the whole scaffold. It's like you have to build the whole scaffold. And even when we was it George Taylor who wrote the book A Secular Age?
Uh,
Was it I think it
Taylor
was. I
sounds right, but not George. Anyway, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Charles
Charles Taylor.
Taylor.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Okay. So in the secular age, I think he says we are living in a very unique time because we can opt in or out of
Hmm.
religion. And I think that we don't even appreciate the task of having to opt in or out and the cognitive drag and the kind of existential horror that comes with the fact that that is even an option, right? Where, in the Middle Ages, it used to be there was just Catholicism. And so whereas today, it'd be comparably more like opting in or out of the theory of gravity. It's like you don't do that.
Hmm.
We all know that when we drop something, it falls. It's like that's how self-evident what we think of as religion today was when these religions were the preeminent forces of civilization. And for it to be the case that you can fully commit to a religious practice out of all the others out there, even that alone, I think, brings in kind of an existential anxiety. And so there is a it is so it isn't just the spiritual exercises and having to like do them on your own, which it's like you absolutely do. It's like you have to get up in the morning and go for a 4 mile run on your own volition at 5 a.m. It's because you're an athlete and you're doing it on your own. That's very much what it feels like. But also it's the building the scaffold itself, the religious scaffold itself. And that's very hard. And I've actually resisted the temptation to just throw myself back into a religious system, um, be it Christianity. I've been very drawn, actually, back to Christianity, which has been surprising for me, and to Buddhism, to Zen Buddhism. But I've really strongly resisted that impulse because I think it's important for me to experience this. I think it's important for whatever reason to kind of exist in this liminal space and not jump headfirst into the next thing. One friend on Substack said, "So it's like you are a serially monogamous person who is single for the first time in his life and in his adult life, and you're just kind of having to be spiritually single for a bit and learn how to do that for a bit." It's like that.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you're trying to learn some lessons and see
Yeah.
what happens and let the next step kind of take place is more of a natural, mature kind of process rather than just jumping from one relationship to another in terms
Yeah,
of
exactly.
yeah.
I don't want a rebound relationship. But also, the wildness of it, I think, is if I become a Buddhist, it's like I'm still very much a Christian. If I become a Christian, well, I'm still very much a Satanist. If I convert to Judaism to join my husband, then I'm still very much a Christian. Um, and so we live in this multicultural age where it's actually very hard to say what one is, you know, because if we're if I'm absorbing all of these ideas, which I am from, I spent 6 years in Satanism and that has deeply shaped me. And then I spent a lifetime in Christianity and that shaped me. And I think my ethics are very Christian. And then, some of the most powerful spiritual experiences I've had have come from Buddhism. And then I'm a member at my husband's synagogue, which I am. It's like, well, how is it possible to say I am one thing and be honest about that? Right.
Right, right.
It's a challenge. It's weird. And there are ways to approach that where it's like, okay, religion is what you commit to. Religion is the community and the identity and the practice that you can commit to, but it can be informed by all these other things, right? So, but there is this sense that because we are in a multicultural age, there people like me have a really hard time committing to one thing, not because we have a fear of commitment, but because we are committed to so many things,
Hmm.
because we are kind of these chimeras where, I'm shaped by like existential philosophy and Aleister Crowley and Christianity and G.K. Chesterton and Judaism and Buddhism and Satanism. It's impossible to say, well, okay, then am I a Satanist? Am I a Christian? Am I a Buddhist? It's very hard to say. And so I kind of wonder if we're like in a new paradigm where we have these these weird chimera religions, these weird chimera religionists. And it's just hard to say what they are.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
that does make sense. I mean, I've been intrigued and confused by the idea of dual religious identities, but you're taking it beyond that. I mean, I've heard of people who call themselves Hindus and Jews,
Yes. Yes.
Buddhists and Christians, and and I realize that human beings we hold incompatible ideas all the time. It's nothing new, but when it comes to religion, my hope is that people would be a little more thoughtful and consistent. But I realize it's a real phenomenon. But you're talking about something not just dual religious identity. You are talking about these chimeras, and it
Yes.
would be interesting to see. Maybe you're the founding prophet of the new chimera religion. Who knows?
Who knows? I hope not. I mean, if there's one thing that I'm now very suspicious of, it is forming new religions
Yes.
deliberately. It's like one thing that TST does have in its favor is that it happened by accident. They did not intend to start a religion, but I won't say that it's a bad idea to start a religion deliberately, just that it's very fraught. And I would not want to start a religion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think we are in an interesting time. For a long time, you've seen obviously religions historically always overlap with each other
Mhm.
and this type of thing. I mean, I think it was last year, year before, I had a member of a UFO religion on, which is fascinating because it takes contemporary UFO ideas and combines it with create almost a twist on Christian creationist ideas.
Yeah.
You know,
Which uh,
human
which group was it?
Oh gosh, I'm having a brain fart. It's the prominent one, the French former race car driver.
Raelianism.
Aliens, yes, yeah,
Yes. Yeah,
yeah,
they're
and we
fascinating. They're so
they are
cool. Yeah.
fascinating. We had a fascinating conversation, but
Yeah.
that's just one example of the overlap of a couple of traditions trying to make something new,
Hmm.
in our time. But you're talking about something else where a whole bunch
Yeah.
of influences are coming together.
It's yeah, and it's really hard to say what I am because I mean it's really hard to emphasize the degree to which these different traditions have shaped me, where I would not be the same person if it weren't for Satanism. I wouldn't be the same person, especially if it weren't for Christianity, and I wouldn't be the same person if it weren't for Buddhism, and and then to lesser degrees other religious traditions. And so it's really confounding. It's really challenging, and I think that many people are actually in this position, but they might just not be aware of it, right? So you have the Christians, for example, who go do yoga and who read Thich Nhat Hanh, and it changes their life, but they still have a very but they still have a self-image of being a Christian despite having brought in Zen Buddhist concepts, and that's totally fine. That's how religion works, right? That's how religion works. But I don't know. For me, it isn't simple. I
Mhm.
maybe it isn't simple because I don't actually have a singular religious identity anymore.
Mhm.
And now that I don't have that, it's hard to know what I am, right?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, so it's hard to know from where you are now, obviously,
Yeah,
just a
exactly.
guess as to where you might end up, but it doesn't sound to me like you would be comfortable identifying at some point, even after going through this liminal phase of identifying with any one tradition. So it's almost like, but at the same time, it's also very difficult to live permanently in a liminal state.
Yes, it's very hard. It's very, very hard. I also think that I have a tendency to strongly identify with a label, and then that makes me stupid. And what I mean by that is the moment a label gets reified as a self within me, it becomes really hard for me to examine it. And so I'm for the a time I'm resisting saying I am X. So, someone could say I am a secular Buddhist. And I think that there is absolutely a way in which that would be true. But I don't call myself a Buddhist. I let other people call me whatever. Someone could say, I am a modern Stoic. And I think that that is in many ways true. Someone could say, I am a cultural Christian, even to use Dawkins' phrase. And I think that that would be true. But what I've found, I've taken this position because one of my biggest regrets actually with Satanism is that I was so quick to take on the label and that I didn't allow myself the time to just enjoy it, to kind of enjoy the culture, the art, the literature, the vibes, the aesthetic, the poetry, the philosophy, the occultism, all that stuff that I love. I didn't give myself the time to just enjoy it. I immediately became it. And that's actually, I think, maybe my biggest regret that I took it on so quickly. And so I'm trying hard not to do that. But the problem is that it's also very hard to do that long term and to not have a home long term because eventually we need a traditions exist for a reason. And eventually we need something to focus our energies, be it Zen, so sit in Zazen every day and have a particular structure and practice that you do. Um, so yeah, it's a weird paradoxical space.
Yeah, and when I hear you talk about this, it reminds me of some of the research and work I did in years past on my graduate thesis on Burning Man Festival. And these folks
Yes.
that create a liminal space, an alternative culture out in the desert in Nevada, and then it's there for a few days and then it disappears and they go back into mainstream society and then they come back again. But one of the things I asked in my paper was how long can they maintain that? How long do you serve as a counterculture in that liminal space without becoming something else and new that then somebody else will be dissatisfied with and pull, it's just kind of a difficult, interesting scenario. And I built that on the idea of the
Yes.
homeless minds thesis that one of the challenges we face now is our minds are not at home in a lot of the traditional structures. And so people are creating new structures, new autonomous zones to inhabit and to create meaning for life. So that,
Yeah,
that it,
absolutely. Yeah. It's this homelessness is, I think, the main term that I would use to describe where I am. And it is, in some ways, it's very exciting. In some ways, it's like the world is my oyster. I can lay claim to any of it, to all of it. Sam Harris, I think, is a really good example of the perpetually unbound, self-identified, unbound kind of person, where he was asked the question, well, what do you replace the Bible with? And he said, I replace it with the entire human canon. That is ours. It is all ours. The Vedas, the scriptures, all of it. The problem with that is that we are just one human, and you can't read all the Vedas, and you can't read all the sutras, and you can't read all the Hebrew scriptures. You can't do it, so you can't actually lay claim to all of it, and so you do have to limit and focus yourself. And so as aspirational as what he said is, where it's like, we can lay claim to the whole body of human literature. It's like, yes, love that in theory, but I am almost halfway through my life now, and I don't have enough time for all that reading. So I'm going to have to focus on something. And not knowing what that something is a sort of homelessness. Yeah.
What do you think the future, what's the plan for Stephen Bradford Long as he's in this liminal space? How do you chart a way to continue forward on your journey?
Well, the most important thing is to not go insane, like to not be insane. And so focusing on staying steady and staying mentally well, that's taking up 80% of my effort right now. Um, but I do also think that that is actually a spiritual and religious project, right? I think that's a deeply spiritual thing. So I've been learning a lot from that process. Um, right now, the most exciting thing is that I've joined a group called the Mankind Project, which came out of the Mythopoetic Men's movement, and I've really enjoyed it. I'm fascinated by it. I'm just attending. I'm like, this thing is cool. I will keep coming to it. It's a men's global organization, and I would call it explicitly religious in way they don't say that they are. They do that thing where they say you can be any religion and do this thing, but it is actually extremely religious. Um, so I've been enjoying that. I've been delving into Greek and Roman philosophy and really loving that. I am continuing to meditate and really loving that. Um, Beyond that, I really don't know. I have no idea. We'll see.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's been fascinating to follow your
Good.
journey and to continue our fellowship. Um, well, you've got the Sacred Tension podcast, you've got Substack. Uh,
Yeah.
Want to give some plugs and folks know where they can find your work?
So unfortunately, the Sacred Tension podcast has been on hiatus
Okay.
for about a year now. I haven't been well enough to just due to health reasons. The workload has been pretty overwhelming for podcasting. So I haven't done any podcasts. I might start the podcast again. We'll see. But all of my work, including my podcast archive and my ongoing newsletters, can be found at sacredtension.substack.com.
Wonderful. And are
Yep.
you still doing around Halloween? You asked for some feedback on some narration you were
Oh,
doing,
yes.
which was really
Yeah.
cool. You still doing that?
So I occasionally do voiceover work. That was the other career that I was trying to start. And I would still very much like to do voiceover. Um, Started a project with Matt Langston called Planchette Horror, which is kind of a radio theater horror storytelling podcast. We released one episode and people loved it. It was a retelling of Dagon by H.P. Lovecraft, and Matt Langston, who's a musical genius, created the score from the ground up around my narration of the story. Um, we've been working on a second episode, but it's just been very, very slow coming. And so I don't know if we're going to do more. I would love to do more. But each of us have insane lives. So But
Yeah.
if we could do a regular thing with it, I would love to. I think it would do pretty well.
Yeah, that would be another great outlet for you is horror. I mean, I know
Totally.
able to get my outlet not only through books and videos, but working on editing projects and this kind of thing. And in fact, I just came out with co-edited volume horror comics and religion, which was really cool
Nice.
to work on. So those kind of
That's
things.
awesome.
I kind of feel that you're familiar with Guillermo del Toro, the
Of course.
film director, and
Yeah.
he's an atheist or agnostic, but he's been asked on numerous occasions, what would your religion be? And he said, the religion of monsters. And I really resonate
Yes.
with that. So, and I would assume you might too. So
Absolutely.
maybe you
Yeah.
can
I
add
mean,
that to the chimera.
what's that?
Maybe you can add that to the chimera.
Yes, absolutely. Religion of the Monsters,
Yeah.
for sure.
So that'd be awesome. Well, Stephen, thank you so much. I'm glad we finally did it after months and months and
Same.
personal challenges and weather tragedies and all kinds of things. And I look forward to putting this up and having people learn about your ongoing journey.
Thanks. Yeah, this was great. Anytime.
Thanks, my friend. Again, this is Stephen Bradford Long. Look in the program notes, and you'll see links that he mentioned in our conversation. And you can please follow his work. Sign up for his stack, subscribe. That helps him as well. And until the next episode of the Multi Faith Matters podcast, this is John Moorhead.